when I started putting this talk together, I had a particular idea, which was, as Marie described, trying to talk about our experiences in fielding planners and the issues that arise in actually making plans execute. So what I want to do is to start the talk by introducing some of those problems, and then towards the end of the talk I'm going to talk a little bit about how we go about solving some of those problems and some of the approaches that have worked for us. So, what is a plan? The strapline that we like to use when we're introducing the notion of planning to people who aren't themselves AI planners is that it's all about this thinking before acting. One of the things that is surprisingly difficult to convey to people when they think about planning and their intuitions about planning is the fact that when we're doing planning, we are sitting separately from the process of execution, perhaps many hours or days or weeks or months before the execution will even take place. And that process, therefore, has to imagine the outcome of the actions that we are going to execute at the point where eventually we will come to execute. So the process of planning involves preconceiving some of the outcomes of the actions that we're going to execute. In order to do that, we have to start with some assumptions about the way the world will be and the way that we can describe the behaviour of the world. And in particular, one of the starting point assumptions is that we are going to make the world a state-based structure. We're going to assume that we can represent it purely by describing it as an evolution through a set of states. Something causes us to change states, to make transitions between states, and those things in particular will include controllable actions, and these are the things that the planner is actually going to be reasoning about. They could also include things that the planner itself and the environment don't necessarily control, so there could be events that just happen, or processes that happen over time. I'm not really going to talk very much about those kinds of things in this talk, but at least keep in mind that those could also be part of the environment that the planning is going to ultimately execute. I'm going to assume that we have an initial state. That is the point of departure from which the plan is going to have to start executing at the point where it's going to execute. It's not necessarily the state that you're in right now, because of course if you're planning for something that is going to happen some distance into the future, you might well make assumptions about what state you will ultimately be in at the point where you want this plan to start unfolding. So you might have some idea about being in a particular location, a particular time, and from that point projecting forward to achieve some goals that you want to achieve. And we're going to assume that there is some causal relationship between the transitions and the states. So when you do something, it causes something to happen in a way that you could predict to some extent. It's got to be sufficiently predictable that there's some point in actually doing this reasoning. If when you do things, the effects are basically random or very highly unpredictable, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest huge effort in anticipating the behaviours and planning for all of the outcomes, because it's going to be very difficult for you to cover all of the unpredictable outcomes that might arise in practice. So these are our key assumptions, and then planning is about choosing the controllable part of this, the controllable actions that are going to bring about some desirable state, or possibly a series of desirable states. And the way that we're going to do that is by anticipating the effects of the things that we're choosing to do. Okay, so this is what planning and what a plan is about. So it's an ordered collection of actions. The execution is going to transform the initial state into one that satisfies the goals. That's what we expect based on the model that we have. As far as we're concerned, a hard problem will typically have hundreds, possibly thousands of steps in it, so that gives you some feel for the scale of the problem. We're not talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of steps. Equally, we're not typically talking about a few steps. We're talking about problems in that kind of middle range there. This is a nice example application of planning that we came across in the community recently. This was a planner used to control a printer. So this printer is actually made up of 4 printers grouped together with a collection of controllable rollers, which are these devices that are sandwiched between the 4 blocks that can direct paper to different locations within the structure of these printers. And it turns out this is the fastest printer in the world. It's a consequence of basically having 4 print engines. And the challenge is to plan where sheets of paper are going to need to be and what imprint is going to be placed on them at each point in time as the plan unfolds. And typically these plans are quite large, these are thousands of steps long, in order to produce large documents, large collections of documents very, very fast. One of the areas of activity that I've been particularly interested in application of planning over some years now is in space applications, as I mentioned. And a particular area where planning played quite an interesting role was in the Mars Exploratory Rover mission. I talked about this a few times during the talk, so I'll just outline, for those of you who don't recall, what was involved. So this was Spirit and Opportunity. This is one of the 2 of them. Sitting on the surface of Mars. The 2 rovers were launched and landed on Mars at the end of 2003, beginning of 2004. And the way that the rovers are controlled, Opportunity is still there, still active 9 years later. Spirit is now defunct, but Opportunity carries on. Is that plans are constructed on the ground by humans using software to help them, but basically by humans, in order to communicate them to the rovers to be executed during the following at least one Sol. Sol is a Martian day, slightly longer than an Earth day, which is why the people who were responsible for this at the beginning of the mission had their own watches that show Martian time, because they were actually having to act on Martian time in order to synchronize their behavior with the communication windows they had to the rovers. Build these plans, you send them to the rover, you leave them to get on with it, and then at the end of Sol you wait for a communication back from the rovers that says, this is what happened. So this is a great example of a very mission critical process involving building plans for relatively long periods of time, anticipating how those plans will unfold in a place that is far removed both in time and space where the plan will ultimately be executed. During the process of construction of the plans, the planners, tactical activity planners, these guys sitting here, don't know exactly what state the rover will be in. They only think that they can anticipate it based on what they told it to do during the last period. They're planning for the next period. When the communication window occurs next and the rover communicates its current status, they have to quickly decide, is that status close enough to the status that we expected it to be in for us to let this plan loose and let the rover go and execute it? Or are we going to have to stop the activity, try and work out what's happened, and see whether we can construct a new plan based on what we now learn is the position of the rover? So they are planning before the execution of the plan is going to happen by typically many hours, possibly even as many as days, and they're then relying on the rover being able to just get on and do the execution of this plan with no further human intervention. It's just got to do it for itself. And this kind of activity that they were thinking about, so this was an plan for Opportunity on the 110th Mars day that it was there. It was looking at a terrain, something like this. This is looking out over Endurance Crater. And the activity that the planners had to put together into the plan for the day involved multiple science operations, engineering activities, which are just things that keep the rover active and operational. And once that was all broken down into primitive levels of activity, that involved 917 activities which solved these various observation tasks with various constraints across those tasks. And this is a fragment of what that plan looked like. I don't expect you to try to read this. What I want to convey from this is what the structure of a plan looks like to people who are actually building them, getting them executed by rovers in this kind of situation. So what we have here is, down this central column here on the left is the activity type and the activity name, and then when will it happen and how long will it happen for. So this is basically time-stamped actions. I'm going to say, do this at this time, it will take you this long. That's what the plan looks like. And you're relying on that executing on the rover as you've specified it. Okay, so this is the model that we have of the way that the planner is going to construct these things. There is some information that is coming in, possibly from sensor data, from logs, from your ontology that tells you the way that the world is, the way you expect it to be. And you use all that information to construct an initial state. That will be what you deliver to the planner. The planner also requires a domain model, so something that tells it what you can actually do. So this domain model describes the actions that are available to the planner. And using that combination of this domain model and the state that has been constructed from this sensor data and so on, you build a plan. That plan is handed off to the executive. Off goes the executive, and your responsibility as planner is now complete. So this is, for people who are familiar with control theory, this is very much like planning as open loop control. You're basically not trying to interact with the execution of the plan, you're simply passing off the actions. You make a prediction about how you expect your actions to affect the world, and based on those predictions, you construct a sequence of actions that you think will achieve your goals, and you then let them go. Off goes the executive to follow your path. Okay, now I want to take a brief break for a history lesson. So this is long before most of you were born, let alone thought about AI or planning. One of the problems that vexed a lot of the early AI researchers was a very simple problem that can be seen as a planning problem called the monkey and bananas problem. Basically the idea is that we have a monkey that has a collection of boxes, and there is a banana tree hanging in a hook up here. So we've got this hand of bananas hanging hook up in the ceiling. And in order to solve the problem, obviously what you want is that the monkey's going to construct this stack of crates and reach the bananas. And I was very amused when I was looking for information about this to find that somebody actually tried this with a pigeon. So here's, and if you can quite see in the light, but there is a banana up there, the pigeon has found it, and now it's going to try solving the problem. So it's worked out it's got to stand on the box, but it hasn't yet worked out where the box has to be. And over time it kind of figures out what it's doing here. It actually solves this problem. But so is it planning? I think probably it's not planning. It's basically executing reactively. It's okay, something there that resembles a plan, because it obviously has figured out that it needs the box in a particular place. Okay, and it gets the banana. So that's monkey and bananas problem. And the reason that I wanted to raise that is because this version of the problem, cat balloon problem, illustrates the difficulty that you have with plans. When you construct a plan, you think about the way you expect the world to unfold, not the way that it will actually unfold when you start executing it. And of course, you see no way in which your carefully laid plan could ever fail. And that brings me to the source of the title for the talk, No Plans by First Contact with the Enemy. I'm afraid that in my abstract I misattributed it to Carl von Clausewitz, but it was actually one of his disciples that made this particular comment. Helmut von Moltke the Elder, whose nephew, Moltke the Younger, was the leader of the German army when they went into the First World War, so I guess that he was trying to demonstrate that no plan will survive first contact with the enemy. Okay, so the point is that open loop control is rarely going to actually help us to solve complex problems. In general, what is going to happen is that the models that we're using to make predictions about the way that the effects of the actions will change the state of the world are going to be imperfect. The plans that we produce will not execute as we expect them to. And the question is, how do we handle that problem? So what are the causes of failure of plans? There are basically 4 causes of failures that I think we generally identify, and they are: actions have unpredictable effects, so you do something, you expected it to have a particular effect, but actually its effects are non-deterministic at some level, and it ends up not having the effect that you anticipated, and changes the state into a state that you hadn't thought you enter. It can also be the case that you find yourself with a problem where there are parts of the state that are unknown, either because you can't gain access to them or you haven't gained access to them because you chose not to. And as a result of not knowing those parts of the state, you end up not being able to choose the right actions to respond to the effects of being in the particular state that you're in. It's also, of course, very highly probable in some domains that things will happen outside your control, external events will occur that change the state in ways that you hadn't anticipated when you were sitting comfortably back at base building your plan, and those are the things that will often cause your plan to break. And of course, in the situations where you're meeting the enemy, the changes to the state might actually be wrought deliberately by agents that are trying to prevent your plan from achieving its objectives. So these are the situations, and just to try to put that into the context of our Mars missions again, so if you think about Spirit and Opportunity trying to execute these carefully crafted plans that were built in the comfort of the tactical activity planning base back on Earth, we find that all of these causes, all of the first three of these causes are evidenced amongst some of the logs of their activity on Mars. So one of the first disasters that happened to Spirit happened only 18 days after it had landed, when an action that was carried out to record data actually caused, for reasons that are more complex than we need to worry about for this talk, caused an out-of-memory event to occur. And the consequences of that were highly unpredictable. The system ended up going into this repeated reset command, which meant that it was constantly attempting to restart. There was a process that was intended to protect it from repeated restarts that actually caused the restarts to stack up. So even whilst it was protected from them happening during the window in which it was restarting, there were other restarts stacking up that it was going to have to respond to once it completed this first restart. And so it was not completing restarts fast enough to clear the stack of queuing requests. And after a period of about 3 and a bit days, it went into a crippled mode. Basically, it locked itself out of almost everything except emergency communications, and even those it was proving very difficult to reliably communicate. And that big arrow, the big vertical arrow between days 21 and 22 on that short picture there, is when Opportunity landed. So this was right at the beginning of the mission. Spirit was the first rover to land, and Opportunity followed 3 weeks later, and obviously they were somewhat panicked by the fact that when Opportunity was due to land, Spirit was currently in crippled mode and they had no obvious way of getting it out of it. They didn't know what they were going to do and they didn't know how to fix it. Fortunately, over the next few days they did diagnose the problem. They worked out what the bug was. It was a bug in the software. They fixed the bug. They flashed the memory from Earth, which was a pretty amazing thing to have to do on a kit out of Mars. They were successful. They did the same, of course, for Opportunity, and everything was successful from that point onwards in terms of this part of the mission. This is an example of an action having unpredictable effects. So the actions here were the reset requests that end up having these unpredicted effects of building up these stacked up requests and resets. Unknown parts of the state, this happened a lot. This was perhaps one of the most problematic that Spirit faced. It faced, and Opportunity also faced, many instances of navigation actions that took them into terrain where the drivers, the rover drivers, who spend a long time planning the trajectories for the rovers from three-dimensional views and satellite imagery and all the kind of data that they can get on the position of the rover and the terrain that they can see ahead of the rover, where is a safe path. Unfortunately, there are always bits of the sand crust on the surface of Mars that turn out to be less solid than they appear from the imagery data that they have available to them. And they end up with these rovers getting themselves into sand traps. And first time that happened to Spirit, it took quite a long time to dig it out. So quite a lot of effort, and apparently most of the building materials from local building suppliers around the NASA headquarters, because they were trying different mixes of sand, plaster and various other powdery substances to try to get the right consistency to match the material that they were meeting on this sand trap in order to work out what they should do with the wheels of the Spirit to dig it out of the sand trap. Unfortunately, in May 2009, it got itself caught in a sand trap on the edge of this crater, and it never did get free from that. And although it continued operations until relatively recently, about a year ago, because of its position on the edge of that crater, its solar panels were not positioned well to allow it to survive into the winter period. It was not some good inclination to the sun, and eventually it lost so much power that it basically died. They had lost communication with it. So Spirit is no more, but its failure effectively started from this point where it executed an action with an unknown part of the state, sand trap. The last of those examples, the intervention from unexpected external events. This happened a lot in the Mars missions. Dust devils were one example of an unpredictable event that occurred around the rovers, and there was no way that on Earth it was possible to make any predictions about when or where these things would occur. And they have quite important impact on the solar power regime that the Mars rovers had available to them. Sometimes if the dust storm and the dust devil went across the surface of the panel, it actually ended up cleaning the panel and made the solar power availability better. And sometimes if you were on the edge of the dust devil and it threw sand and gravel across the panels, it would make things worse. There was no way to anticipate what would happen and when that would happen, so you simply had to kind of allow for some flexibility in your power model to allow for the possibility of these events occurring. But of course, you could never be sure how many and when they would be. As far as we know, there were no deliberately obstructive state changes on Mars, so we think that everything that happened there was accidental. Okay, so control theorists would say, well, yes, the obvious way to deal with the problems that you get from not thinking about the effects of the actions that you're executing is to monitor the effect of the actions and react to those effects. So you do closed-loop control. Read your state, use sensors, and respond to that measured state, and then control your effects accordingly. So why is closed-loop control not simply the thing that we should do instead of thinking about doing planning at all? Plans are really required where what we're thinking about is making long-term decisions. We're thinking about making decisions over long horizons. Control decisions are typically short horizon decisions. And the places where planning is most important are places where decisions that you make about your locally optimal actions, so actions that are close to you, that are short-term decisions, might have catastrophic effects for the long term. So it's possible that what looks really good in the short term is actually taking you into a state from which there will ultimately be no return, because in the long term you've got yourself into a dead end. You're going to actually go down a series of states from which it will not be possible to recover. That's where planning is important. You need to be thinking ahead in order to anticipate those effects and avert the disaster before it happens. And so you need to make decisions that account not only for the current state, but also the long-term effects of the actions that you're thinking about. Okay, so let's just think about the way that these shapes of failures arise in practice, looking at our model in terms of a state transition system. So this is what a plan looks like. We have a sequence of states, we have a sequence of transitions, which are the actions that we have selected, that take us precisely from state to state through this path, from our initial state to our goal. We expect no deviation from it. What could go wrong? Well, if one of our actions produces an unexpected effect, the behaviour as far as the model of the state transition system is concerned is that we effectively have a non-deterministic action. We have an action that could lead us into multiple possible output states when we execute it, starting from a particular state in which the action is applicable. So in this case, action A3 might take us from state S2 to state S3 as we predicted, but equally it might take us to state S3 prime, which we had not predicted and had not chosen to plan from. When we have uncertainty about states, one way to model it is to model it as belief states. So we can model our states as sets of physical states, world states, and say the state that we're in is actually one of these states. And both of these ideas, non-deterministic transitions and non-deterministic models based on sets of states, are familiar to those of you who think in terms of finite state machines and state transition systems more generally. They're classic ways of modeling non-deterministic behaviour. So how can we react to these problems, the plan failures? So let's suppose for a moment that when an action has had a non-deterministic effect, so it's applied, we didn't know which state we're going to end up in. Let's suppose for a moment we can actually identify which state we did end up in. So let's, for a moment, put aside the problem of state uncertainty and just focus on what happens when we've got actions whose effects are not necessarily predictable. What can we do to supply a decision about the action that we will use to leave that state? So notice that in our original plan, the key thing that we needed was an action that would tell us what we were going to do as we left each state. So in each state that we expected to be in, we knew what we would do once we arrived there. And that's really the thing that characterises our plan, the knowledge of the next actions performed based on the state that we're in when we identify it. So one possibility is if we find ourselves in a state that we didn't have an action for, we didn't know yet what to do, is that we replan. Now this is slightly different from the situation that I described at the outset, where we were going to be planning from the comfort of our armchair, anticipating execution of our plan long and far away from where we are. If we're going to do replanning, we're actually in a state where something went wrong and we're now trying to fix it. That means that we're typically going to be replanning in a situation where we're under stress and pressure. The system that is trying to do the replanning is not anticipating being in this state, didn't know what it was going to do when it reached it, and now has to diagnose the state and choose an action from it that makes sense. That is often not a recipe for producing good plans, but nevertheless this is a possibility. Okay, so in this case it essentially looks like this. We start from state S3 prime, which is the state that we've now found ourselves in at execution time. We sit in that state long enough to think about what we should do next, and we plan our trajectory right through to the goal, and then we start executing again from that point. Another option, so I should say that is the strategy that we have tried out in Mars analog missions. So this was an EU ESA funded project that ran for a couple of years, finished last year. This was the final field trials that we did in Tenerife, which is treated as Mars analog terrain. You can see it looks very much like Mars, apart from the bushes. And this was the rover that we had. This was one of our partners, Aberystwyth, has this rover. And we went and spent a couple of weeks on Tenerife running these rovers on the volcanic plateau there, trying out these various ideas of doing autonomous science collection. So planning on board. So the key thing here is that in this context where we're replanning, we're sitting in the state from which we want to carry out that plan. So it's kind of real-time replanning. We're really under pressure to produce a plan here and now that fixes the problem. That can be bad if we're trying to plan from a state that was one that we didn't anticipate because it's a failure. In practice, in the project that we were looking at here, we were considering situations where actually the state you're in is good, better than you'd anticipated. And the reason that it was good is that it offered a science opportunity that you hadn't thought you would get. And we wanted to react to those science opportunities by carrying out science operations locally on those things that we'd identified as potential science targets and exploiting the opportunities efficiently. And that is something that the Space Agency is very interested in, because if you look at the Mars rover missions, you can find several examples of situations where exciting science opportunities were almost missed or were missed because the rover plan hadn't anticipated that they would exist, and it carried on past those opportunities and off into the distance, only downloading the data that allowed the scientists on the Earth to recognise those opportunities long after the opportunities had been lost. A very famous example is one called Block Island, which was a large rock in a sandy plain that the rover wandered past, and it was only 30 days later that the data that contained that image got downloaded, because it had to be prioritised for download. Scientists saw it and immediately said, we have to go back, we have to go and see this rock, and the reason is because the rock is not in a crater and it's not embedded in the ground, so the only way that it could have got there was by being carried by water. So that demonstrated the significant impact of water on that part of the terrain, in particular on that rock. So they wanted to go back to examine it and find out exactly what had happened and so on, which took another 30 days. So 60 days of their mission were taken up by moving away and coming back to this one science target, and we were interested in avoiding that cost. However, of course, in some situations, in many situations, replanning from scratch in the new state you find yourself in is going to be too slow. We're sitting in real time having to react to it. With the rovers, we have the fortunate situation that nothing much happens if you sit still. In Mars environment, nothing is going on around you. Basically, you can expect that if you sit still for a while and think, you aren't going to change the state very much. You will use a little bit of power because you're going to invest power in the processor and the actual planning itself. But apart from that relatively small state change, nothing else is likely to change from now until the point when you decide you've got a plan. But if you're trying to execute plans underwater, then sitting still is actually quite hard. And similarly, if you're trying to replan in a context where the environment is changing very quickly, you can't afford to spend a long time in this process of replanning. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to have a plan ready in case. So you anticipate the possible outcomes and think about planning for those cases. And actually the problem that we're now thinking about, as you start thinking about uncertainty and trying to anticipate the states that you might get into, can actually be modelled as a Markov decision process, or if we're going to have state uncertainty, a partially observable Markov decision process, MVP. And people work, of course, in the planning community on solving these kinds of problems. And so effectively everything that I say from now on about how we deal with problems of this sort can be seen as one of the possible repertoire of techniques for tackling problems of this kind. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that we now start talking about policies. So a policy is like a plan, except that instead of only telling you what to do in the states that you thought you would visit, it tells you what to do in every possible state. So it anticipates every possible state that you might get into and tells you which action you should apply when you get there. Unfortunately, building a policy is typically going to be infeasible computationally, and storing it is unlikely to be practical, assuming, as is often the case, that we're going to have some kind of extensional representation of this mapping from state to action. In some cases, you can get a much more compact representation, an intentional representation, where you effectively have a function that tells you if you're in a state, you apply this function to that state, and it will combine the metric parameters that describe that state and turn it into a control action. And actually that works very much in control theory, where often there are relatively few modal variables, discrete variables, and a lot of continuous variables, and you can combine those continuous variables to provide some action to get you out of the current state. Partial policy basically says let's only worry about the states that we think are most likely. So instead of trying to build a complete mapping from every possible state that we might find ourselves in to an action, let's just worry about the states that we think are actually likely. And that is effectively what we call contingency planning. So it's intuitively what you think of as contingency planning. You try to anticipate how could things go wrong, and you imagine those states and you plan for a reaction to each of those states. So you've got a backup for each of the possible situations that you anticipate finding yourself in. And how good is a partial policy? Well, it depends on how many of the most likely states you've thought about, how successfully you've covered all of the likely states, and whether you've got plans for all of them that are effective. Somewhere in between running a policy and running a replanning strategy is an incremental policy, where effectively you start with a partial policy, but when you arrive in a state for which you don't have a reaction because your partial policy wasn't complete, you choose some sort of replanning strategy, you build a policy extension, you add it to the policy that you've already had, and now you've got a way of getting on from this current state, and because you store it, if ever you return to this state, your policy now covers that situation. So you kind of incrementally improve your policy as you meet new situations. One of the interesting questions that you have to decide how to answer once you start thinking about planning under uncertainty is what exactly you're trying to achieve. So when you're thinking about deterministic problems and you're thinking about planning your way from an initial state to a goal, it's pretty obvious what you want to achieve. You want to get to that goal state, and you'd really like to do it with minimal cost. That's it. Once there is uncertainty, it's less clear, because it might be that you want to maximise your probability of getting to your goal state, whatever. It might be that actually there is a reward, a benefit associated with being in that goal state, but there is also a cost with the actions that you could execute to get there, and you want to balance the cost against the reward, so you don't want an unconditional charge to get to the goal that you're trying to achieve. And it could be that what you care about is minimising risk. So it might be that you're not so worried about the cost, but you're really worried about losing the mission. So if you pay a vast amount of money to get your space rover onto Mars, the thing that you might most care about is not maximising science, but minimising risk of losing the mission, so that you can carry on and do a bit more science tomorrow. Or you might want to maximise your expected reward. So maybe you do want to maximise science and not worry too much about the risk. If you've got a safe state, then it's very straightforward to do the kind of reasoning that I've been talking about in incremental policy development or replanning in order to salvage yourself from one of these unreasonable states. But there are lots of missions that you could imagine where that kind of safe state simply doesn't exist. You don't have a way of putting the system into a state where it could simply wait until further instructions come. One mission that has been talked about is kind of being projected for future possible space activity is a mission to Europa. Europa is one of the Jupiter moons, and it's got an ice cap, and it's thought that possibly under the ice there might actually be liquid water, because it's thought that there will be vents at the bottom of the oceans on the surface of Europa, where there could even be, possibly, either proto-life or life forms, or who knows. If you were ever to get a mission onto the surface of Europa and drill through the ice and actually get a robotic system under the ice cap in order to try to approach one of these vents, as soon as it's under the ice, it's out of communication. There isn't any chance that Earth will be able to tell it what to do. So now it has no safe state. It can't just sit and wait and rely on Earth telling it what to do. It can't even sit and rest, because its power supply will be tightly constrained. It's going to be in an environment that is difficult to anticipate, but very difficult to imagine that we'll be able to sit in some kind of neutral buoyancy and just wait for a planner to work out what to do. So you really need to be able to react very quickly to the situations that you encounter if you're in a situation like that. Okay, so how do you go about building policies? Well, the traditional approaches that people have used for solving Markov decision processes, and partially observable Markov decision processes, is to take the Bellman-Ford equation, which is an optimality criterion. It's not particularly important for this talk what the details of that are, but basically there's an equation that describes optimal solution structure, and then you can iteratively converge on a solution to that equation by using a dynamic programming approach. And there are two main strategies for that. One is value iteration, where you focus on looking at improving the values of the states that you are building, and the other is where you look at policy iterations and focus on building and improving policies iteration by iteration. Neither of those approaches are feasible for even moderately sized databases, so we really have to find a better approach to tackling these problems, and unfortunately, because the Markov decision process, problem solving Markov decision processes is X time complete, you can't really anticipate finding good general solutions that will help you solve your problem. And that's even when they're highly structured, they're X time complete. So on the very constraining assumptions, you can still end up with really very, very hard problems. So what can we do? Well, basically the technique that you want to exploit is to avoid thinking about the unlikely states. The real challenge for solving these problems is that the state space is, in interesting problems, very large, but most of those states are states that you will never visit, and you really don't care what the action would be that would optimize getting out of those states, because the work involved in finding those actions is simply not worth the investment for the likelihood of actually finding yourself in those states. So how do you work out which states are likely? One of the ways that people have found recently to be a very powerful technique for tackling uncertainty in a whole range of applications, not just in planning but in general decision making under uncertainty, is this idea of Monte Carlo sampling. So, well-known idea, quite an old idea. Basically, choose one sample through your probabilistic space, and you say what would happen in that sample. And if you sample enough, you build up a picture of the landscape of your probability distribution and responses to it. You couple that idea with hindsight optimization, which is this particular idea in which you say, let's suppose that we knew what the outcome of the actions and the observations that we might perform was before we executed them. What would have been the best thing to have done? So we kind of work out, in hindsight, what would we have done better, best, in order to solve this problem. So now, given a Monte Carlo sample, basically you've sampled, you've determinized, you've got one particular outcome for all of the uncertain events in your problem space. You now say, what's the best possible solution that we could have come up with if we'd known in advance that that was the way it was going to unfold? And that's a planning problem, because now you've got no uncertainty, you know what's going to happen, so you just solve it as a planning problem. Which means that all of the work that we've done on solving deterministic planning problems becomes relevant to tackling these problems under uncertainty if we can find a way of translating the Monte Carlo samples and this hindsight optimization strategy into a solution to our general problem. So this is the general approach that we have been exploring. We've used it in several application areas. You basically sample thousands of instances. These pictures actually show models of algal blooms, because one of the application areas that we have looked at is trying to control AV, automated underwater vehicle, autonomous underwater vehicle, to track these algal blooms as they move around in the ocean. In fact, we were working in Monterey Bay, tracking these algal blooms. That was called detention. And what you do is you sample lots and lots of instances of the problem. You plan high quality solutions, so you've now got solutions to those individual instances, and then you use that to construct via a classifier a mapping that takes you from the state to the action. So you've now got lots and lots of examples of what's good to do in particular states, because your planner told you what would have been the right thing to have done, or the best thing to have done in all of the states that these various thousands of solutions and thousands of states in those solutions led you through. And now, using that, you can basically construct a policy which will be the classifier, the output of the classifier. It's going to be, well, we've done a tree-based, decision tree-based classifying structure. It takes the state structure, which is described in terms of collections of variables, and those variables are then tested as you pass your way down this decision tree, and you end up with an action that leads. In doing that, one of the things that you're most concerned about is the fact that when you're executing your plans in the real world, what you can observe about the states will be typically less information than the planner had, because the planner was working with the benefit of hindsight, so it had access to a complete picture of the world. So that means that when you're unrolling your policy against real execution, you really need to be thinking about what are the states that you will actually be able to see at execution time, because those are what I need to use as the basis of my classification so that I can build the correct model of my policy. It's the things that I will actually be able to see that I will be able to react to in order to select the correct action. So when we plan, we have a model of the state which is complete, but when we learn what was the right thing to do in response to the state that we visited in those plans, we use the observed states and the actions that are taken from those observed states as the input to the classifier. Okay, very, very simple example just to round things up. So this is a silly, trivial example just to illustrate how the idea works. So we've got a farmer who's sitting on his tractor at the barn. He's got to get to the pasture, and he's got two possible routes that he can take. One is a long route, long lane, which is going to take 40 minutes to execute. Alternatively, you could go up the hill, which takes 10 minutes, and then follow the second road from the hill down to the pasture, which will take another 10 minutes. That's going to obviously be half the time, so much more preferable. Why would he not always choose to do that? Unfortunately, that road leads past the river, and it's going to be flooded out with a probability of a third. So a third of the time, get to the top of the hill, which is the first point at which you can see the state of the river, and only at that point will you know whether the road is passable or not. So 1/3 of the time you've got to the top of the hill, and you aren't going to be able to carry on. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to back up, and unfortunately, because it's a very tight road, it's going to take 20 minutes to back up from the hill back up to the barn. And then, of course, you're stuck with going the long route now. So if you mistakenly went to the top of the hill to discover the road is flooded out, it's going to take 10 minutes there, 20 minutes back, and 40 minutes down the long way before you get to the pasture. So 70 minutes if you go that route. So what's the best thing to do? We can represent this as a state space model, of course. We've got effectively two variables that describe the state space, so very trivial state space structure. One of them is the location, where currently the farmer is, and the other is what's the river road status? Is it flooded, or is it passable, or do we not know? So double question mark there means we don't yet know. So if we're in a state where we're at the barn but we don't know what the status of the road is, that's the state that we're in, and we can execute an action. So the obvious action that we might consider executing is driving to the hill, which will cost us 10. And if we execute that, we'll actually end up in one of two states. So this is a non-deterministic action. Either we'll be on the hill and the river is not flooded, so the pass is okay. Otherwise, we're on the hill and it's flooded, so there's no way through. So those are the two possible states that we could end up in after we've driven to the top of the hill. And it's non-deterministic, but we have a probability that tells us that we're 2/3 likely to follow the first path and only 1/3 likely to follow the lower path. If we get to that first state, we're on the hill and the road's okay, then we should drive to the pasture and that costs us our 10. If we go to the hill and it's flooded, then we have to follow this other path where we back down the hill, costing us 20, and then we drive along the lane, costing 40, and we arrive in the pasture with a different state, pasture with the road flooded as opposed to the pasture and the road free. But both of those are goal states. We don't care which of those states we're in, because the only thing we cared about was that we were at the pasture. So long as we can get to one of those two states, we've satisfied our solution to the problem, found a solution to our problem. So we only now care about identifying which is the most efficient of those two to go to. And there is an alternative opportunity, which is from the barn, we just drive along the long lane, and the cost will be 40. Non-deterministically, we'll end up in one of those two states, either the pasture and the road is passable, or the pasture and the road is flooded, but we don't care which of those states we end up in, because both of them are goal states, so either way we'll have satisfied our goal. Just to complete the state transition diagram, these are the only states that are actually interesting for solving the problem, but there are some other transitions, so just to be clear about what those are. If you got to the top of the hill and the road was flooded, it was passable, so you could carry on if you chose, you might nevertheless decide that you were going to back down the hill and drive along the long way. And opportunity is there for the planner to consider, even though we can see obviously it's an inefficient solution to the problem, but we can't assume that it's obvious to the solver that these solutions can be ruled out immediately. They have to consider what possibilities are open to them and explore them more within that. Okay, so that's our state space. So if we sample and solve, what's going to happen? We're going to create lots of samples, and in 2/3 of them, the river road is going to be passable, because that's the probability of the road being passable, and in 1/3 of them, it's going to be flooded. The planner is going to be presented with those as problem instances, and because the planner knows what the road is, passable or impassable in every one of those instances, before it sets off, it will absolutely without error select the best path to follow. So it will always go down the long lane if the road is flooded, and always go across the hill if the road is not flooded. It will never make a mistake because it has been told what the state is, and with the benefit of hindsight, it can therefore choose which is the right solution to follow. We now have a large collection of examples in which 2/3 of the time from that initial state you're going to go up the hill, and 1/3 of the time you go down the long lane. So that means the classifier is going to say, I think going up the hill is the right thing to do, because 2/3 of the examples tell me that's the way out of this state, and only 1/3 tell me it should be the other. That means that's the policy that I will start to construct. I will say, if I'm at the barn, I don't know what the river road status is, I will drive to the hill. If I'm at the hill and the river road is passable, then I'll drive to the pasture. And that's what I choose as my policy. But of course it's incomplete, so we now roll out that incomplete partial policy against instances of the problem, and we say what happens. So in the third of the cases where the river road is flooded, what's going to happen when we roll out this policy is that we're going to get to the top of the hill and we're going to find ourselves in a state for which we don't have an action. We're at the top of the hill, the river road is flooded. What do? We need to plan from those cases and add those states to policy. So we identify further states, on hill and river flooded. We have to drive to the barn, and if we're at the barn and the river's flooded, we drive down long lane. And we add those to our policy, and that in fact is a complete policy that solves the problem, and it solves it with an expected cost of 36.7 compared with the cost of taking long lane of 40. So we've got a cheaper policy than we might have expected if we simply taken the reliable route. What if we switch around the probabilities? What happens? So supposing the probability of flooding is 2/3 instead of 1/3. Well then, what's going to happen is that 67% of our example problems, the planner will choose to go down long lane, and that means when we learn the policy will say, well, if we're in the state where we're at the barn and we don't know what the river road is like, we'll drive along long lane, and the cost of that will be 40. And that compares with an expected cost of using the hill of actually 53.3 in that case. So we still end up with the best plan. This will not guarantee to find the optimal plan. The choices of probabilities there matter. If you start probing in the middle between 2/3 and a third, we do perfectly well for some of those probabilities, but as you home in on probabilities around 50% or so, things begin to get flaky. We use policies that are less robust and actually turn out to be suboptimal. Okay, so I'll wrap up. Planning is to try and find a solution to the problem before anything actually needs to be done, but uncertainty at execution time is what turns out to be the enemy of planning. That's the thing that we are trying to avoid contact with, or that's where we can expect our plans to fail when we have first contact with it. So, what can we do to try to avoid the problem? Sampling and solving using our deterministic planner, but tackling the uncertainty by meeting it up front and actually trying to analyse what state we might end up in allows us to construct partial policies which will deal with these most likely contingencies. And there you go.